In the winter of 1849, the American dream wasn't a house with a white picket fence. It was a blood-soaked riverbed in California. But while thousands chased the glimmer of yellow metal, a silent few were chasing something far more valuable: the secrets that would determine if the United States would remain one nation or crumble into a collection of warring territories. This is not the history they taught you in school. This is the story of the gold that never reached the banks and the men who died to keep it that way. Chapter 1: The Ghost of the Sierra. The Sierra Nevada mountains did not care for human ambition. To the mountains, the thousands of men crawling over its granite skin were nothing more than ants. Elias Thorne wiped the frozen grit from his eyes. His hands, once the soft hands of a Boston clockmaker, were now blackened by permanent dirt. He wasn't here for the gold, or at least that's what he told himself when the hunger pangs grew too sharp to ignore. He was here because he was running from a ghost. In 1849, San Francisco was a city made of canvas and desperation. Ships were abandoned in the harbor, their crews having deserted the ships the moment the word Eureka hit the docks. Elias moved through the muddy streets, past the gambling dens where men lost fortunes in a single hand of faro. "Thorne!" a voice barked through the fog. Elias froze. He recognized that gravelly tone. It belonged to Captain Silas Vane, a man rumored to be working for a shadow department within the Department of State. "I heard you were dead in Coloma," Vane said, stepping out of the shadows of a makeshift saloon. "I was," Elias replied. "I found it suited me." "The President needs men who are already dead, Elias. There is a shipment of bullion leaving the southern mines, 5 tons, but it's not going to the mint in Philadelphia. There's a conspiracy involving British agents and Southern secessionists. They want to hijack the gold to fund a private army." Elias looked at his trembling hands. "I'm a clockmaker, Silas. I fix gears." "Then fix this," Vane leaned in, his voice a low hiss, "because if that gold disappears, the Union won't last until the next election. The clock is ticking for America." Chapter 2: The Sierra Vein. Leaving the soot-choked air of San Francisco felt like escaping a fever dream. Elias and Sarah moved eastward, their path carved by the heels of thousands who had gone before them. The trail was littered with the debris of broken hopes, discarded cast-iron stoves, rotting wagons, and shallow graves marked only by river stones. "You don't walk like a miner," Sarah said one evening, her voice low as they huddled over a small fire of manzanita wood. She was still wearing the oversized canvas coat and the slouch hat that hid her features. To the world, she was Sam, a quiet youth from Illinois. "And you don't talk like one," Elias countered, sharpening a hunting knife. "Most men out here speak in grunts and curses. You use the king's English like you were born to it." Sarah fell silent, the orange light of the fire dancing in her eyes. "My father was a cartographer for the Spanish crown before the Americans took California. He knew these mountains better than his own home. He knew where the old gold was, the veins the Spanish missed because they were too busy building missions." Elias paused. "Vane mentioned the southern mines. He said a shipment is moving through the Miwok trails. If Sterling's men get there first, they'll have enough leverage to buy half the governors in the east." "The Miwok trails aren't on any map, Elias," she whispered, "but they are in my head. If we want to stop Sterling, we have to go where the sun doesn't hit the canyon floor. Chapter 3: The Ghost of the Dunner Pass. The air grew thin and biting as they ascended into the high Sierras. Here, the history of California was written in ice. They passed the remains of the Dunner Party's cabins, a grim reminder of what happened when the mountains decided you weren't welcome. It was here they saw the first sign of the enemy. Through his brass spyglass, Elias spotted a line of black horses moving with military precision across a ridge 3 miles out. These weren't miners. These were filibusters, private mercenaries hired by Southern interests and backed by British gold. They carried the new Colt Dragon revolvers, weapons that could fire 6 shots before a man could reload his musket. "They're moving towards the Stanislaus River," Elias noted, his heart hammering against his ribs. "We can't outrun them on the main trail," Sarah said, pointing towards a jagged split in the granite walls. "We take the Devil's Slide. It's a shortcut, but if a horse slips, it's a 500-foot drop." Elias looked at the treacherous path. He was a man of gears and balance, of delicate springs and measured time. He realized then that California was a land without balance. It was a place of extremes, extreme wealth, extreme violence, and extreme beauty. Chapter 4: The Alchemy of War. They reached the hidden encampment at the Stanislaus River just as the sun began to bleed into the horizon. Below them, in a natural stone amphitheater, sat 12 heavy wagons. These weren't filled with supplies. They were loaded with heavy wooden crates, each marked with a discreet iron seal. Elias saw Sterling standing by the lead wagon, looking at a map. Beside him was Captain Vane. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Vane hadn't sent him to stop the shipment. Vane had sent him as a scout to clear the way, to ensure no other government agents were in the area. "The Union is a corpse, Silas. We are simply the undertakers. Once this gold reaches the coast, the British Navy will escort it to New Orleans. By spring, the South will have the treasury it needs to secede. The Americans will be too busy fighting each other to notice they've lost the West." Elias felt a cold rage. This wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about the clocks he used to fix, the delicate mechanism of a young democracy. If these men stole the mainspring of the nation's economy, the whole machine would shatter. "Sarah," Elias whispered, reaching for a pouch of black powder he had bought in Sacramento, "how good are you at starting fires?" She looked at the wagons, then at the dry brush surrounding the camp. A grim smile touched her lips. "In this heat, it'll go up like a tinderbox." "We don't need to steal the gold," Elias said, his mind working like a master horologist. "We just need to make it impossible to move." Chapter 5: The Molten Trap.
The plan was madness. As night fell, Elias crept down the scree slope, his boots muffled by rags. He moved through the shadows of the boulders, his eyes fixed on the axle of the lead wagon. He didn't use a gun. He used his watchmaker's tools. With surgical precision, he began to unscrew the heavy linchpins of the wagons, replacing them with wooden pegs he had carved to look like iron. They would hold for a mile, maybe 2, but the moment the wheels hit the steep descent toward the coast, the wheels would fly off, sending tons of gold into the deepest ravine in the Sierras. Suddenly, a hammer clicked behind his ear. "You always were too curious for your own good, Thorn," Vane growled. Elias didn't turn around. "Did they pay you in pounds or acres, Silas? What's the price for selling out a country that gave you a uniform?" "A country is just a line on a map, Elias. Gold is the only thing that's real." Boom! The horizon erupted in a wall of orange flame. Sarah had signaled the Miwok scouts she had encountered earlier. The dry scrub caught instantly, creating a chimney effect that roared down the canyon. In the confusion, Elias spun, knocking the revolver from Vane's hand. The two men grappled in the dirt, the heat of the fire singeing their hair. Above them, the panicked horses began to bray, and the wagons started to roll. "The pins!" Vane screamed, realizing the danger. "Stop the wagons!" But it was too late. The heavy wheels groaned. The wooden pegs Elias had installed snapped with the sound of pistol shots. The lead wagon tilted, its heavy crates shifting. With a sickening roar, the wagon tumbled over the ledge, followed by the second and the third. 5 tons of gold bullion, the wealth that was supposed to fund a civil war, disappeared into the darkness of the gorge, crashing against the rocks until the crates shattered, spilling yellow bars into the white water of the river below. Chapter 6: The River of Lost Fortune. The sound of the wagons shattering against the rocks was a symphony of destruction. It wasn't the sound of wood breaking, it was the sound of a geopolitical shift. As the crates burst, the river below, a churning artery of ice melt and silt, swallowed the wealth of 1,000 men. "My gold!" Vane roared, his face contorted by the orange glow of the encroaching fire. He lunged for Elias, but the clockmaker was no longer the soft-handed artisan from Boston. He was a man forged by the trail. Elias sidestepped the charge, using Vane's own momentum to hurl him toward the crumbling edge of the ridge. Vane teetered, his boots kicking up sparks and gravel, before he caught a jagged outcrop of rock. He hung there, suspended over the same abyss that had claimed the bullion. "Help me, Thorn," Vane gasped. "There's more gold in the hills. I can show you." Elias looked down at the man who had traded his honor for metal. "The time for deals is over, Silas. The clock has run out." He didn't push him, but he didn't reach out either. A secondary explosion, likely the mercenaries' black powder supply, ripped through the camp behind them. The vibration was the final straw. The ledge gave way, and Silas Vane vanished into the smoke-filled darkness without a sound. Chapter 7: The Silent Alliance. "Elias, we have to move!" Sarah's voice pierced the roar of the fire. She appeared through the haze, her face smeared with soot, leading 2 horses that had miraculously remained tethered. Behind her, the Miwok scouts were melting back into the tree line. They had no interest in the white man's gold, only in the removal of the invaders who had brought fire to their sacred hunting grounds.
They rode hard toward the northwest, the opposite direction of the coastal trails. Sterling's surviving mercenaries would be scouring the road to San Francisco, but they wouldn't expect anyone to head deeper into the high Sierras during a firestorm. As they reached a high plateau where the air was thin and clear of smoke, Sarah pulled her horse to a stop. She looked back at the glowing orange scar on the horizon. "It's gone," she whispered, "the money that was supposed to buy a war." "It's not gone," Elias said, adjusting the strap of his satchel. "It's just in the one place where no one can spend it. The river will bury it in silt within a week. In 50 years, people will tell legends about the ghost shipment of the Stanislaus, but today it's just rocks in a stream." Chapter 8. The Price of Silence. The journey back was a grueling test of human endurance. To keep their secret, they couldn't return to the main camps. They lived off the land, eating pine nuts and the occasional rabbit, moving like shadows through the granite cathedrals of what would one day be Yosemite. During these weeks, the real history of the West unfolded around them. They passed Chinese laborers building the foundations of a new world, and met 49ers who had lost everything but their pride. "When we get back," Sarah asked one night under a canopy of stars that looked like spilled diamonds, "what will you do? You can't go back to fixing clocks in Boston, not after this." Elias looked at his hands. They were steady now. "The world is changing, Sarah. The telegram is coming. The railroads are coming. They'll need people who understand how the gears of this country work, and they'll need people who can keep secrets." Chapter 9. The Fog of San Francisco. They arrived in San Francisco in autumn 1850. The city was transforming. The canvas tents were being replaced by brick and mortar. The news of California's admission as the 31st state was spreading like wildfire. It was officially a free state, a blow to the Southern interests that Sterling had served. Elias walked into a small telegraph office near the wharf. He sent a single coded message to a contact in Washington, D.C., a name Vane had mentioned before his betrayal. Message: "The shipment is secured by the Earth. The mechanism is reset. The Union holds." He never received a reply, and he didn't expect one. As he walked out, he saw a figure in a fine woolen coat standing by a carriage. It was Julian Sterling. The British agent looked older, his aristocratic poise replaced by a weary bitterness. He had lost his gold, his men, and his mission. Their eyes met across the muddy street. No words were exchanged. In the world of shadows, silence was the only currency left. Sterling climbed into the carriage and vanished into the fog, most likely bound for a ship back to London to answer for his failure. Historical fact-check: the secret war for the West. While many think of the gold rush as a purely economic event, it was a hotbed of international espionage. The British, French, and even the Russians had eyes on California. If the U.S. had failed to secure the territory, or if the gold had been diverted to the Confederacy a decade early, the map of North America would look very different today. The Stanislaus incident remains one of those whispered legends, a story of how two nobodies saved a superpower. The final epilogue. Elias Thorne did return to the world of gears, but not in Boston. He became one of the first special agents for the newly formed Postal Inspection Services, the precursors to modern intelligence agencies. Sarah disappeared into the history books, though some say a woman matching her description was the one who mapped the secret passes that later allowed the Union Army to move gold safely during the dark days of 1861. The gold remains in the Stanislaus River to this day, buried under 100 feet of sediment and the weight of a nation's history. Some say on quiet nights when the moon is full, you can still hear the phantom sound of wagon wheels snapping in the wind. The saga of Elias and Sarah doesn't end with the burial of the gold. In the world of 19th century geopolitics, a secret that big has a way of haunting the living. Chapter 10: The Vigilance Committee. San Francisco in the early 1850s was a place where a man could be a king at noon and a corpse by sunset. The city was burning, literally. The great fires were becoming a seasonal ritual, often set by arsonists to mask robberies or to clear land titles. Elias had taken up residence in a small brick-walled workshop on Montgomery Street. He spent his day.
Part 15. The Return to the Coast of Graves. When Elias arrived back at Port Huron, the town was different. The white hurricane had left a permanent scar. The beaches were still littered with the splintered remains of lifeboats and the rusted skeletons of heavy machinery. He found the fisherman, a grizzled Norwegian named Olaf, in a shack that smelled of salt and dried perch. "They came for me, Elias," Olaf said, his voice trembling. "Men in suits. They asked about the crates you mentioned when you were delirious. I told them I saw nothing, but they burned my boat anyway." Elias looked out at the lake. It was blue and calm now, a deceptive mask over the graveyard below. He realized he couldn't win by fighting them in a courtroom they owned. He had to play a different game. Part 16. The Final Gamble. Elias leaked a story to the Chicago Tribune, but not the whole story. He didn't mention the gold. Instead, he told them about the structural flaw, a specific design in the Scott's hull that made it a death trap in high waves. He claimed he had a copy of the blueprints that proved the company knew the ship would capsize. It was a bluff. He had no blueprints. But the Iron Lords panicked. They couldn't risk a technical investigation that would ground their entire fleet during the most profitable year in history. They offered Elias a pension, a massive sum of money to move to the West Coast and never speak of the lakes again. Elias took the money, but he didn't go to California. Part 17. The Silent Guardian. Elias Thorne disappeared from the public eye in 1915. Using the blood money from the shipping companies, he secretly funded the first private maritime safety foundation. He bought radio equipment for small vessels and paid for the education of young navigators, teaching them how to read the clouds instead of the orders from the company office. He lived out his life in a small lighthouse on a remote stretch of Lake Superior. He became known as the Hermit of the Storm. The full truth of the Isaac M. Scott didn't emerge until 1976, when divers finally reached the inverted wreck with modern sonar. They found the ore was indeed mixed with lead-lined boxes, and the hull showed signs of being reinforced in ways that weren't on the official records. Elias was long gone by then, but his legacy remained. Every time a storm warning blares across the Great Lakes today, and every time a captain decides to drop anchor and wait out the gale instead of pushing through for profit, the spirit of the man who survived the White Hurricane lives on. The Great Lakes still hold their secrets, tucked away in the cold, dark pressure of the deep, but they no longer hold the monopoly on the truth. The story of 1913 serves as a permanent monument to the fact that while men may build giants of steel, they are but splinters in the hand of the inland sea. Part 18. The Echoes in the Iron. The pension Elias had extracted from the Iron Lords was more than a bribe. It was a weight. He kept the money in a heavy iron box beneath the floorboards of his lighthouse, never spending a dime on himself.
He viewed it as ghost currency, belonging to the 28 men who had shared his final dinner in the Scots galley. By 1920, the world was moving on. The Great War had come and gone, and the 1913 storm was fading into the fog of local folklore. But the lake never forgets. One evening, as the first winter gale of November began to rattle the thick glass of the lighthouse lantern, a visitor arrived. He wasn't a man in a suit or a sailor with salt-cracked skin. He was a young man, barely 20, with eyes that mirrored the cold gray of Lake Huron. "My name is Julian Scott," the boy said, standing in the doorway as the spray of the lake soaked his wool coat. "Your father was the captain of the ship that bore my name. You were the last person to see him alive." Elias felt a chill sharper than the wind. Captain Scott had been a company man, yes, but he was also a master mariner. "Your father stayed at his post," Elias said, inviting the boy in. "He was at the wheel when the world turned upside down." Part 19. The Captain's Secret. Julian didn't want money. He wanted the truth. He pulled a letter from his pocket, a final correspondence mailed from the last port of call before the Scott vanished into the white hurricane. The letter was a confession. Captain Scott had known about the gold. He knew the ship was being used as a pawn in an international shadowboxing. But there was more. The gold wasn't just for a Mexican coup. It was a repayment, a secret shipment of bullion intended to buy back a cache of stolen industrial blueprints that could have given the U.S. an edge in the coming European conflict. "My father didn't go down because of a storm," Julian whispered. "He went down because he refused to let the gold be offloaded to a secondary vessel in the middle of the lake. He knew that ship was a black vessel, unmarked and manned by mercenaries. He thought the storm was his only way to keep the gold from falling into the wrong hands." Elias realized the terrifying scope of the tragedy. The Isaac M. Scott hadn't just been a victim of nature, it had been a fortress. The captain had steered into the heart of the hurricane, not out of negligence, but to use the chaos of the weather as a shield against a mid-lake hijacking. Part 20. The Final Dive of the Spirit. Elias and Julian spent the night poring over charts. Elias showed the boy exactly where the ship had rolled. He described the Three Sisters waves and the sound of the rivets snapping. "The government will never let you bring it up," Elias warned. "The water at 180 feet is a different country. It has its own laws." "I don't want to bring it up," Julian replied. "I want to bury the secret for good." Using Elias's resources, they hired a small, discreet salvage tug under the guise of scientific research. They traveled to the coordinates where the Scott lay inverted. With them, they carried a specialized charge, a localized explosive designed to collapse the primary access tunnel Elias had used to escape. As they hovered over the site, the sonar pinged the massive, ghostly silhouette of the freighter. It looked like a sleeping whale, ancient and indifferent. Elias stood on the deck, the cold wind whipping his white hair. He closed his eyes and whispered the names of his crewmates: Thomas, Miller, O'Malley, Captain Scott. They triggered the charge. A dull thud vibrated through the hull of the tug. On the sonar screen, the silt rose in a great cloud, settling over the Isaac M. Scott like a permanent shroud. The Gold Ghost was now sealed in a tomb of mud and crushed steel. Part 21. The Horizon's End. Elias Thorne lived to be 84. He died in 1945, on the very day the war in the Pacific ended. His last request was to be cremated and his ashes scattered not in the lake, but in the wind during a November gale. He wanted to be part of the air that the sailors breathed, a warning and a witness.
The story of the Isaac M. Scott remains one of the most mysterious chapters in American maritime history. While other wrecks like the Edmund Fitzgerald gained more fame in cinema and song, the 1913 storm stands as the deadliest event to ever hit the Great Lakes. In the archives of the Treasury, there is still a discrepancy in the 1913 ledger, a missing shipment of bullion listed as lost to maritime disaster. But to the people of the lakes, the gold doesn't matter. What matters is the reminder that the inland seas are not mere lakes. They are vast, wild spirits that demand respect. And somewhere beneath the shipping lanes, where the water is always 34 degrees and the light never reaches, the Isaac M. Scott remains. It is a monument to a time when men were made of iron and ships were made of dreams, and to the one man who clawed his way back from the abyss to tell the world that the truth is often heavier than gold. Epilogue: The Modern Sentinel. Today, when massive 1,000-foot Lakers navigate the St. Clair River, the captains often look toward the shore where the old lighthouses stand. They know the technology has changed: GPS, satellite weather, and steel that can bend without breaking. But they also know that every 100 years or so, the lakes gather their strength for another white hurricane. The ghost of Elias Thorne, the man who saw the world upside down and survived, is said to still haunt the radio frequencies. In the midst of the worst storms, when the static is high and the waves are crashing, some sailors swear they hear a faint, rhythmic tapping through the speakers. Clang, clang,